podcast is brought to you by Delta Neuro Health, located in Columbus, Ohio, where non-invasive, personalized care is revolutionizing the way we approach complex neurological issues. With cutting-edge techniques in functional neurology, functional medicine, and chiropractic care, we're leading the way in managing conditions like concussion, dizziness, brain fog, anxiety, POTS, attention, and more. To learn more, visit our website at deltaneurohealth.com. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Neuro Health Broadcast. I'm your host, Dr. Coppus, and today we are joined by Grace Thomas of Grace Grit. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm excited to chat.
Of course. So we've been working together a little bit outside of the podcast, and I love what you do with uh, with how you're using your extensive knowledge of nutrition and helping patients and athletes get so much better. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, why you got so invested in nutrition in the first place?
I am a registered dietitian and got my master's degree at Ohio State in dietetics and nutrition. I was a collegiate runner at Ohio State, a distance runner, kind of what got me started in the field of athletics. Was always a very active individual growing up, did a lot of sports. My kind of life revolved around sports and athletics. But I was never really taught the nutrition education to excel at the Division I level. When I got into college athletics at Ohio State, my mileage, soared through the roof and I just kept getting injured. I was struggling a lot with low bone density, got DEXA scans and already was at osteopenia at age 19, had loss of a menstrual cycle, was struggling with some disordered eating, a lot of depression, anxiety, and I was diagnosed with REDS, which is relative energy deficiency in sport, which is a continuum of what used to be the female athlete triad. So it takes a look at every part of the body that's impacted by low energy availability or LEA. So we're taking a look at energy in versus energy out. And when we're not at equilibrium, many parts of the body break down. So we're talking, metabolically, we're talking cardiovascularly, we're talking endocrine, we're talking hormones, and everything starts to kind of break down. That's where we see the low bone density. We'll start to dip in a little bit more into the disordered eating. It can start unintentional and intentionally with athletes. Mine very much so started unintentionally. I just thought I was eating cleaner to be a better athlete. And was just trying to do the things to be a better runner. And I was just doing the training I was told to do. With that, I was severely overexercising and not bringing in enough calories. And that was kind of what led me to want to become a registered dietitian, was to then help a lot of athletes who were struggling with very similar symptoms, but also to really work with high schoolers and young athletes to help them prevent this once they got into the collegiate or professional level. And so I went into grad school at Ohio State, got my master's in dietetics and nutrition and specialized in sports nutrition. So I still did my clinical and outpatient rotations, but took a really big focus in sports nutrition. And that was, really what led me to start my private practice, Grace's Grid. And I focus a lot on working with all types of active individuals. So not just quote unquote athletes, but anyone who is active, works out, 3, 4 days a week. I consider them an athlete. I think a lot of people look at me like I'm crazy, but I think we don't realize how much more food we need when we are an active individual. So I obviously take a big heart in marathon runners and runners, high school level, collegiate and professional level, but work with all different kinds of sports and just active individuals overall. It may be an individual who is focusing on weight loss, but is also really focusing on training for their first marathon or kind of running their first half marathon. So it really just depends on the type of client, and I keep everything very individualized. But my kind of mission and like role at Grace's Grit is just to teach people to learn more about sports nutrition and how to fuel their bodies optimally to avoid that low energy availability, with also creating a healthier relationship with our food and body is a big another focus of my business. So my practice is completely telehealth. I get to work with all of my clients remotely, which is awesome. And I really kind of take a big focus on evidence-based research. I love research. research and I love having evidence to back up everything that I'm doing from an intervention standpoint. And I love collaborating with other practitioners, like yourself on patients and working with other doctors and working with therapists and physical therapists and personal trainers. And it really allows to have that collaborative care. And I love talking with other people in the professional health world because it allows us to really kind of fine tune our different practices and our niches and how we can come together and create a better like overall collaborative care.
For sure. And I think the piece that you bring to the table is often one of the most overlooked, yet a lot of times the most important thing for patients who are struggling. You know, traditional healthcare doesn't always consider diet and nutrition as well as it should, and looking at the landscape of how the things we eat, how we eat, it's changed a lot over the past few decades. So I love that, you are stepping in and providing your expertise in this way. And you had mentioned that you got your start really because of personal experience with your marathon training. So,
So not with
or sorry,
marathon,
not marathon.
but
Yeah,
yeah, collegiate level
that's
at
right.
Ohio State. Yeah, I hope one day I'll run a marathon, but we'll see about
Yeah.
that.
So, so it's still a lot of miles.
Yeah, yeah.
So what are some of the considerations that maybe somebody who's not training versus somebody who is training at that level need to take?
Yeah, I love this question. So I think probably the biggest difference we're looking at from, an athlete who is kind of at that peak level of performance and maybe someone who is, not really, into a lot of activity, but maybe is trying to get into it, it's going to be the carbohydrate in our glycogen stores, right? The more activity that we're doing and the higher intensity of the activity, the more carbohydrates we need to bring in. So we have certain levels of carbohydrates we need based on activity load. And I have athletes taking anywhere up to 8 to 12 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates, which is a lot of carbohydrates. But those are for individuals who are training 2+ hours a day, endurance athletes, or there's someone who's doing more high intensity, right? Every different type of athlete needs a different level of carbohydrates. So, a sprinter is going to look a little bit different than a distance runner from a fueling perspective. And we have different protein needs as well for athletes. So our protein is going to be a lot higher than general public for an athlete, especially if it's a strength-based athlete. So if you're looking at more of a lacrosse player compared to, again, a distance runner, the lacrosse player is going to need more protein than the distance runner needs. So a lot of what I do in practice is teaching people more about how their needs are specific to their sports and their activity level. With my marathon runners, it's really going into the science of any exercise over 92 hours, we need 60 to 90 grams of carb per hour. So people that are taking in one gel every hour at a marathon are under fueling. And it's why a lot of people will quote unquote bonk a race. So that's something I work on a lot with patients is trying to focus on how can we get enough carbohydrate in during a marathon every hour.
Mhm.
And a lot of that comes with carbohydrate training, and we're really trying to train the gut. And a lot of the research I focused on in college was exercise-induced gastrointestinal syndrome. It's very hard for athletes to bring in a higher amount of carbohydrate if they're not training the gut. And we see a lot of GI distress with athletes. And that is a really big other piece of the puzzle is fueling is very challenging during exercise if you've never done it before.
Right.
So we have to really try to practice that.
Mhm.
And the other big thing too is we have different performance plates for different days of training. Our fueling might not look the same on a moderate intensity day compared to a 2 a day or a high intensity day.
Mhm.
And so we really have to work around what does your fueling look like for different practice schedules and different practice days and how can we fuel differently on those days, right? A higher intensity day, half our plate should be carbs, whereas on a rest day, we could have just a fourth of the plate carbohydrate. So our carbohydrate needs will change based on activity load. And I think that's always hard for people to kind of understand in the beginning is I think a lot of people still fear carbs in our world. But carbs are our main energy source, especially as any type of endurance athlete. So yeah, it really comes down to like what are the basics of our macronutrients? What does each macronutrient do for us? And why are they important?
Mhm. And then the other two big macronutrients being fat and protein, how do those come into play for, say, a distance endurance athlete versus more of an explosive athlete?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, more of an explosive athlete is going to have a higher protein need. So, sometimes I'll take them even up to 1.8 to 2.0 grams per kilogram. Whereas a distance runner, honestly, we kind of say more in that like 1.4 to 1.6 gram per kilograms. Sometimes a little higher, sometimes a little lower, depending on there for like a mid D or a full distance. But majority of those calories are going to be coming from carbohydrate. Fat is really that primary focus, especially for hormone health, right? I see a lot of times an athlete coming to me and they're kind of focusing a lot on protein and they're getting an over excess amount of protein and they're really lacking on the carbs and fat and they may not have a period, or for a male their hormones might be kind of out of whack, and a
Hmm.
lot of that comes from those fats are very important for hormonal health. So if we don't have enough fats there, it's also what's protecting our organs. So I think sometimes we forget about fat, and fat is something that should be in all of our plates. And so, yes, definitely still focusing on protein and fat. I think right now, currently, especially with social media, I think protein has a lot of hype. So I
Hmm.
think a lot of people come to me, everyone's telling me to eat my body weight in grams of protein. And honestly, that's an excess for like 99% of individuals, right? There may be a small amount of individuals who that could be right for them. But I would say most people are trying to overdo protein and forgetting about the carbs and fat. And
Yeah.
we get a lot of fiber from our carb sources, which is very important. And so I think it kind of all comes together into building a balanced plate. But, for a moderate intensity day, we have equal parts carbs, color, protein, and then we still have our serving of fat. For a heavy training day, we have half carbs, fourth color, fourth protein, and our serving of fat. In a rest day or a low intensity day, that plate changes to half plate color. That's where we build up on more of the colors, the fruits and vegetables, fourth plate carb, and a fourth plate protein. So I really try to focus on visualization of our macronutrients because it allows people to better understand like what should my plate actually look like to support that day of training.
Hmm. Makes sense.
Yeah.
And then how does that maybe differ from maybe the general population who, I want to work out here and there. I want to lose weight, I want to look
Yeah.
good. I couldn't really care if I, you know, broke the top 10 in my age group in a marathon, but
Yeah.
what kind of considerations go into that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think sometimes people overlook like, oh, if I'm not fast or I'm not, quote unquote athletic, then I don't need to fuel like I'm an athlete. And I think that's actually where I see the most low energy availability or under fueling. And, I think a lot of people come to me and they're struggling with weight loss and they're actually over exercising or just not eating enough. So
Mhm.
oftentimes we have to increase calories to help someone aid in weight loss, but really for an individual who is not at, peak performance, right? But they're still trying to train like that, maybe working out a few days a week. It's really still focusing on balance plates, right? For them, let's say they're focusing more on weight loss, we do want to have a higher protein need. And when we're eating our carbohydrates, we want to think more about complex carbohydrates and think more of those fiber sources. So we're thinking like a quinoa, the brown rice, whole wheat pasta, whole wheat bread. Those are going to contain fiber, keep us a little bit more satiated, and help with blood sugar control.
Mhm.
Whereas the athletes are going to need a lot more simple carbohydrates before training. Simple carbohydrates are going to come from more of the white enriched grains, from a lot of our fruits, for example, fruit snacks or dates, or any type of fig bar. These are all going to be those simple carbs before training. Now, an active individual still needs to get in a carb source before training, right? It could be a banana, right? But really, in those main meals, they want to focus on more of the complex carbs, lots of color, and then really meeting those protein needs. So I
Mhm.
would say the biggest things that change is they may not need as much carbohydrates as someone who's training 2+ hour a day. Obviously, they don't, right?
Mhm.
But it's also thinking about what types of carbohydrates you're utilizing and making sure that we still all need carbs for energy, but sometimes we need different sources of carbohydrates. And so it's really just educating on what are some proper carbohydrates for me, for my body, and for what my goals are. And then we kind of fine tune that on an individual basis.
Okay, makes sense. I know there's a lot of different diets out there, right? So everybody has their opinion on, which diet is the best.
Yeah.
I've read books on how the vegan, vegetarian, plant-based diet is the best. I've read books on how the carnivore diet is the best and everything in between. So, when you're working with your clients and maybe they come in with preconceived ideas of, what they think is the best diet, or maybe they really want to stick to carnivore, or maybe they really want to stick to plant-based. How do you kind of field that and then work within those confines, or do you try to get them away from those confines? I'm curious.
That's a good question. So I think it probably goes two ways. I will say from the very top, I do not believe in diets. The word is can be very confusing to some people. And what I
Mhm.
mean by is I don't believe in a restrictive diet that restricts specific food groups
Mhm.
because they are not sustainable, right? Especially when it comes from like someone trying to focus on a weight loss. And I think diets have a time and place. I think there's specific diets that have great evidence-based research for specific conditions.
Mhm.
For example, someone with a gastrointestinal issue, we may need to do some type of elimination diet of specific foods. Or for example, someone with migraines, we may be taking out certain histamines for a small amount of time, right? So I think, the word diet can be used in different ways. Now, I think there's kind of two ways that it could go, right? Let's say someone's coming into me that is a vegetarian. I do have multiple vegan and vegetarian athletes. That is what they believe in. I would never try to change that. So
Mhm.
what I do is help them support that, right? Are we making sure that we're getting in enough of the big ones for especially runners is we're thinking B12 and ferritin, right?
Mhm.
Or our iron levels. So that would be something that we're looking at, making sure we're getting lab work done, making sure that we're getting in enough of those sources, right? And we may need to use some supplementation there, right? So I think it's meeting them where they're at. That's not a diet I'm going to try to change on someone.
Mhm.
But let me give another example on the flip side of an athlete that I've been working with for a while who's an ultra marathon runner. And he came to me eating majority carnivore diet. He was eating a lot of meats and fats, and he was an ultra runner. So he was not getting in enough carbohydrates. And he was someone who was relying on an energy drink multiple times throughout the day, was feeling major fatigue,
Mhm.
was eating a pound of meat in one sitting, and was running 100+ mile weeks. We've completely changed his diet using evidence based. And, in the beginning, I said, you don't need to change any of these are just my recommendations, my professional recommendations. And he's a completely different runner now.
Mhm.
So sometimes it is, meeting them where they're at and telling them, this is my opinion. We don't need to change it, but let's start small. So we started very small with little small changes and slowly started to add some carbohydrate sources to the meals, slowly started to reduce the protein. His gut got completely better. Drastically because he was eating such a high amount of protein, he was just not digesting.
Mhm.
His energy improved. He wasn't relying on caffeine anymore. And the big thing for him is his recovery and injuries improved.
Mhm.
So I think, there are ways for us to change our diet and modify, but then, like I said, there are some diets that someone comes in and we're not going to change that.
Mhm.
So let's meet you where you're at and let's focus on making sure we don't have deficiencies and
Mhm.
that we're not lacking in our macronutrients
Mhm.
because a vegan and vegetarian diet can be a completely wholesome diet as long as you're doing it the correct way,
Mhm.
and making sure that you're getting in each nutrient. And that's not something I'm going to try to change for someone, right?
Yeah.
Now, I have had some athletes who have decided to like incorporate meat back into their diet. It's maybe something that they felt they wanted to do, and it has like improved, for example, their iron or ferritin levels. So for some people, they do try to make some changes like that based on performance, but that I wouldn't even consider that a quote unquote always like a diet. It's more of kind of a lifestyle and personal choice that they want to eat vegan or vegetarian.
Mhm. Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I know that's probably a question that's going to get a lot of contention in the
Yeah.
comments, but
Yeah.
thanks for answering that. Um, a follow-up question is um, so we've talked a lot about quantity of macros.
Yeah.
So how does quant no, sorry. Yeah, we've talked a lot about quantity of macros. How important is the quality of the source of those macronutrients?
Love that question. Yeah. So I think again, I like to meet people where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely am someone who believes in eating more of an organic whole food source diet. But also as someone who is a sports dietitian, there are certain foods for athletes that are going to be processed that are very, very important in their diet.
Hmm.
And I think sometimes like people overlook that and the importance of some processed foods for athletes. But I definitely believe in eating a more whole food sourced diet. I think one of the biggest things, honestly, that I focus on with every single one of my clients is increasing color on their plates. And
Hmm.
I always just say the word color because, 70% of Americans are not meeting their fruit and vegetable intake.
Hmm.
And that is crazy, right? Because fruits and vegetables are so important in our diet. They're giving us fiber, they're giving us vitamins and minerals, they're giving us antioxidants. So they are so important in the diet. And just that alone, increasing color on our plate can be incredible for someone in every aspect of life.
Hmm.
So when it comes to kind of quality of food, it's can we increase, produce? Can we increase fruits and vegetables? Can we start shopping more on the outside of the grocery store to get more whole food sources?
Right.
And then a lot of times I get that question of like non-GMO, organic,
Mhm.
grass-fed. And that's a tough question as a dietitian. Number one, because not everyone has the financial stability to shop that way. So if a client comes to me and they're like, oh my gosh, like I just can't afford the wild caught salmon
Mhm.
or the grass-fed meat or the organic vegetable, then I just start not getting it. I would rather them choose the non-organic option and still get in the nutrients than them be stressed about not choosing the quote unquote organic option, right?
Mhm.
It's kind of like the example of like Whole Foods versus Giant Eagle, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes people over stress about that, and I'd rather you just get in the whole food sources.
Yeah.
Um, but it also comes down to two, certain processed foods are great for our diet, right? And there are some processed foods that are going to be more of like an organic option. I think people don't realize something like nut butter is considered processed, right? Any type of good bread is considered processed, and we can
Mhm.
still buy really good breads that are sprouted grains or fresh sourdough. It's still part of a process, right? So I think a lot of times people think of like we have lots of different labels of processed foods, and the overly processed foods are the ones that we obviously want to reduce in the diet.
Right.
But there's also still a time and place to have some types of processed foods.
Hmm.
But can we build majority of our plate with whole foods is always what I try to strive for,
Hmm.
right? For a high school athlete, does it make sense for them to not use granola bars or fruit snacks or applesauce packets for fueling? Absolutely not, right? Do I still utilize things like that in my fueling for running? Absolutely, I do, right? Because that is a carbohydrate source that's going to be utilized the same as if I was choosing a fruit.
Hmm.
But should a general public be choosing all of those things on a constant, every single day? Probably not, right? But can
Right.
we utilize those for exercise? Absolutely. So I think that goes two ways. I'm definitely a whole food source dietitian, but we have a time and place for our processed foods specifically around training, and they're crucial for performance. If we didn't have them, we'd probably be under fueling, especially when it comes to like the incorporation of gels and chews. Those are very processed, right? But they are very important for someone to be able to finish a marathon. And I do have clients where they believe and they don't want to spend the money on gels or want to use more food based. And we're able to do it with more food based, right? It is a little bit cheaper sometimes. So, again, it's like I've been saying this entire time. I meet a client where they're at, right? It definitely comes down to what is their access to nutrition, what is their financial stability for nutrition, and what are their preferences. It's not always easy to get a client to try to switch to more whole foods right off the bat. But as long as they're getting some sort of, microwavable vegetable or a canned vegetable and rinsing it to get the sodium off,
Hmm.
they're still getting in those vitamins and minerals and getting in the nutrients they need, even if it's not quote unquote fresh,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That's a
Makes
good
sense.
question. That's a good question.
Yeah. Um, and I'm well, I guess I'm a long distance runner as well. And I remember, I mean, I've run two marathons so far. The first time I had never had a gel before.
Oh boy.
And I was like halfway through actually running the marathon and like they handed them out. I'm like, oh, what is this? And I just took
Oh,
it. I'm like, oh, this is helpful.
oh my gosh, you had never fueled during like your training
No.
sessions
Oh
or
no. I mean,
anything.
I was
Oh
probably
no.
like 25 and I'm just like, I'm gonna go out and run and keep
Oh my
running. And
gosh.
so yeah, definitely wore my body down. It was pretty interesting. Side note, I mean, I was in my urine analysis class at that
Okay.
point. I was in school still, and I think the next week we analyzed my urine and we just looked at how much my body had broken down from that run.
Oh no.
And you know how I fueled after the marathon? I'm like, I'm gonna treat myself to my fantasy fast food meal. So
Okay.
I just went around and I got every fast food, my favorite from each one, and yeah, terrible idea.
Yeah,
Terrible.
not the best way to recover from the marathon
No.
either.
I could have used your help
Yeah,
back
yeah. I
then,
think
but
people don't realize that like I also give people a recovery protocol for like
Mhm.
right after the race and what they should be eating. And people are like, come on, is this when we like get a beer and stuff? And I'm like, if you want to feel like crap the next day, like
Yeah,
please don't do
right.
that.
Yeah, that's so important and I can definitely attest to that.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. So you really kind of touch on the whole spectrum, you know, from the lay population who just want to get healthier, people who may be struggling even, so people we might consider patients or people with a specific condition, helping them to get healthier, and
Yes.
then people who want to perform and get even better, you know, people who are on
Yes.
maybe the other end of the spectrum. So that's
Yes.
pretty amazing.
Yeah, I kind of have like three little buckets. I kind of have like general public, where maybe it's a client coming to me for nutrition education or for weight loss or their lab work. So maybe it's high cholesterol, a really high A1C or blood sugar, maybe pre-diabetic, a cirrhosis patient. Then I have that bucket of kind of more, like I said, more that chronic patient or condition. So I do a lot of eating disorders, which are only athlete-specific eating disorders. And these are those types of patients that I'm really collaborating a lot with their pediatrician or their doctor, their athletic trainers,
Mhm.
their therapists, their sports psychologists. So that's a really kind of big piece of that recovery portion there.
Mhm.
And then I have like that bucket of just, my performance athletes, right? This is going to be your high school, collegiate, professional, and recreational athletes, and marathon runners would be in that bucket. So I kind of have those three buckets, which my niche was always like sports nutrition, but I have loved working with kind of general population as well, because
Mhm.
for me, it's good to go back into like my clinical roots from school. And I do love just like teaching people about nutrition, and I love talking about nutrition, as you can tell. So I'm very passionate about that. And I love doing talks. I love getting in front of people to chat about things
Mhm.
when it comes to nutrition. So that's where I get more of that like worksite health promotion, general population nutrition education piece from. And a lot of times too, I feel like that is what really sharpens my knowledge in nutrition and keeps it fresh and sharp, is by still having more of that clinical side and the athlete side there as well.
Yeah, it really has to keep you on your toes, I'm
Yeah,
guessing.
yeah.
Yeah, and
It
I'm sure
does.
it never gets dull either. I
It
mean,
never does. I always feel like I have a new patient that always keeps me on my toes. And I also feel like as a young dietitian like myself, I love that because it keeps me continuing to learn, and I have great mentors in my pockets.
mhm.
And I chat with other dietitians all the time. At least once a month, I'm meeting for coffee or virtually with another dietitian in private practice, or one of the professors at Ohio State. So that is something that really helps me just, stay up on the research. And I'm also a part of the Sports Dietetics Association, and we do a lot of collaboration on evidence-based research. And that is a really great group that helps me stay updated on the current research as well. And I think that's important, is just making sure that you have those people around you to continue to learn and educate.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, well, we can obviously tell just how passionate you are about nutrition. Um, where do you want Grace's Grit to get to? What do you want to achieve, and what do you want to change in the field of nutrition?
Oh, that's a tough question. That's a loaded one. So I would say, I really want the impact of Grace's Grit to come from like my personal story. And I really want to help, athletes learn what fueling adequately means. So many individuals are under fueling and not knowing.
Mhm.
And I want people to understand that food is fuel and food is energy, and food equals increased performance.
Hmm.
And that is something I really want people to always learn from working with me is the power of food and how important it is.
Hmm.
But the other big piece too is to always, understand that your health is more than just, going to the doctor and just having lab work drawn or getting all these metrics done. And if you don't have the diet piece and the exercise piece, that is such an important part of our overall health for just longevity. I think about like the blue zones. I'm sure you're familiar with
Hmm.
the blue zones and thinking about people in different countries who live the longest. And so many parts of that are based on what they're eating and the exercise that they're doing. And it's such a holistic approach, but it's so important to have these pieces together because that ultimately is what is making us healthier. And even when I look at like the big picture of my clients, no matter what bucket they're in of a client, I am always focusing on diet and nutrition. And I'm always focusing on exercise. It may be that we're increasing exercise, but also may be that we're, for example, decreasing high intensity exercise in a female who's lost her period, right? So in every or every client I work with, athlete or not, nutrition and exercise is something I talk about in any session. And I think just that intercorrelation is so important. And as a personal trainer too, I love it because I still work with clients too in the gym. And so I really get to collaborate more holistically on both pieces. And I think for me too, my mission is just to continue to create a healthier relationship and knowledge around nutrition. And a lot of that comes with nutrition literacy and teaching and teaching and teaching. And that's my hope is as I continue to grow as a dietitian, I continue to teach, and I continue to make lives better through nutrition. So yeah, I think that's definitely a long answer to that question, but I think ultimately with Grace's Grit, a lot of my business is rooted in faith and rooted in kind of that grittiness and performance and diving deep down into like where we are as a human and where we want to be. And I think just allowing ourselves to always live our days with a little bit of grace and a little bit of grit is kind
Hmm.
of my mission. It's what I believe in and what gets us to where we want to be. And for my athletes too, it's really using my personal story to explain to athletes that there is a way out. And, when I felt like, you know, everything was going to end and I was never going to get out of the place that I was in. And now I'm helping these athletes. It's so cool to look back and be like, wow, I never thought I'd get out of that dark place. And here I am now. And I've gotten to talk with thousands of athletes now at this point, doing seminars and talks. And every single time, it's so surreal to me that I'm here and have this private practice. And I get to help people every single day and do what I love and I'm just so grateful for it.
That's awesome. I love that. Love that.
Yeah.
So, if somebody's listening to this now and they are loving what you're saying and they really want to work with you and reach out to you, what would the process look like from how would they contact you? What would initial consultations look like? And then the process moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, someone can book an intro call with me through my website at Grace's Grit or through my Instagram, Grace's Grit. An intro call is just a 30-minute video or phone call with me. I use an EHR HIPAA compliant platform for all of my clients. So you'll get logged in there and we'll just have an appointment. I like to do this 30-minute call just to learn a little bit more about a client who's interested in services and then get to tell you a little bit about, my services, what I offer and my pricing. And from there, if someone decides to sign up, I have different types of packages and programs. My main programs are 3 months long, and I also have different like a la carte options as well. If we're doing any type of testing, those are things that can be added on. And then with programs, I have a minimum of 3 months for a program. And throughout that time together, we're doing food journals where we're doing taking pictures of our meals. We're getting feedback. We're recording like our bowel movements for someone with GI distress. We're recording our activity in there, our hunger and fullness around meals, our thoughts. And in there, we're also having, our short and long-term goals. What are our long-term goals with working together? What are those short-term goals that we're working on in between sessions? And that initial consult is really where we gather anthropometric measure, health history of the client, dietary intake, gastrointestinal health, sleep, lab work. And I like to see that client as an entire whole, right? It's a very holistic approach where I'm not just, asking them what they eat. I want to know everything, right? Because there's so much more than to just what we eat. It goes into play with sleep and gastrointestinal health, mental health. There's so many components of the puzzle with nutrition. And that initial consult is really the longest assessment with me. And then from there, we kind of build that plan and that protocol. Maybe it's a client who needs a little bit more recipe building and recipe development. Or maybe it's a client who needs a little bit more help on some education on specific topics. So I kind of build that intervention and protocol based on what that client's goals are and what they need. And then from there, we just continue to work together as long as they feel like they need me. I have some clients who work with me for 3 months, but I have clients who have been with me over a year now. So it totally just kind of depends on the client, which I'm sure you understand as well. Like some people are with you for a really long time, some people are just here and there.
Mhm.
But I really do like to have a minimum of 3 months with my clients because we're not going to make a nutrition change in a week or 2 weeks. And we need time to make some nutrition changes. So I feel like that 3 months has really been helpful in my practice to be able to see some better results with client and some really good client retention as well. So lots of different options for services. And if anyone's ever, interested or nervous, they can shoot me a message or book an intro call and, we'll just chat a little bit and see if we would be a good fit working together.
Awesome. Love that. And again, it's gracesgrit.com would be, the first place to reach out, your website. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
So, Grace, this has been fantastic. Really, really fun episode, I think. We covered a lot.
Yeah.
So I think our listeners are going to get their money's worth for this podcast. Um, so yeah, I couldn't recommend you enough. So I appreciate you coming on today.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was awesome. I look forward to chatting another time.
Of course, looking forward to it. All right, and then for everybody out there, take care.